Welcome to Recovery with Root, a podcast centered on topics surrounding mental health and addiction. Through our Advanced Recovery Institute, a new entity of the Root Center for Advanced Recovery, we are committed to research and training to elevate clinical care. We hope you find this podcast informative, and most of all, we hope that it helps improve the lives of others. Remember, we're in this together, and recovery is possible. Welcome back to another episode of Recovery with Root. I'm Margot Farrell, Chief of Staff here at the Root Center for Advanced Recovery. Today, we are joined by Dr. Shane Murphy. He is a professor of psychology at Western Connecticut State University, amongst so many other things. Shane was formerly the head of the United States Olympic Committee Sports Psychology Department. He has worked with Team USA at several Olympic Games, 1988, 1992, 1996, and worked with several other athletes along his career. He's also a past president of the Society of Sport and Exercise Performance Psychology of the American Psychological Association. He's currently the co-chair of the editorial team publishing the new APA guidelines right now for professional practice in sports psychology, and he's written a number of books, and his research primarily focuses on imagery in sport, burnout in athletes, and performance and assessment of psychological performance skills. Shane, we are so excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Margot. It's good to be back.
Yes, last time we spoke was about a year ago, right before the Paris Olympic Games. You and I were actually on a podcast together. So I thought it'd be great, kind of 1 year post Olympics, to meet back with you. We talk about all different types of topics on this podcast, mental health and addiction. And, our last podcast episode was concerning teen mental health and keeping the routine going in the summer months. And so some of the questions I've got for you today are going to surround some, kids in sports and those kinds of things. But I kind of just wanted to get a general opening question for you to just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about, why you got involved with sports psychology and what maybe drew you to this industry.
Sure. Well, it was a combination of things. One, I grew up in Australia, and anyone who knows Australians know they're sports mad. And so I was a big follower of sports. I would have been a really good athlete, but I had three things going against me. I was very slow, very weak, and I made bad decisions under pressure. But apart from that, I would have been great. But I've played tennis all my life, and obviously I grew up on things like cricket and rugby. So sports was always in my background. And then I became a psychologist, and I came to the United States of America in 1980 to pursue my PhD in clinical psychology at Rutgers University. And while I was there, I got into sports psychology. It was just, I was interested in sport. And I hadn't realized that there was this whole area of sports psychology. And so I worked with some folks in the physical education department. I did my master's and dissertation research in sports psychology. And then fortunately for me, when I was on postdoc down at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, the position opened up in Colorado Springs for the first full-time sports psychologist. And I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, really. And, they were looking for somebody who could work with children, because a lot of young, both kids and adolescents, passed through the Olympic Training Center. In those days, a lot of them actually lived on site for programs in sports that were not, well supported in other areas of the American culture. And so I did that for nearly 10 years. And then, I went into private practice, and then ended up at Western, where I just retired last June. So I'm now a retired professor from Western Connecticut State University. But as you said, I'm still working on the professional practice guidelines and so on. So it's really exciting to see the way the field has evolved over the last 40 years.
And that was something, I remember we had kind of discussed a little bit on the podcast that we were on, talking about how different the field is. And, myself having been an athlete a while back and, having retired in 2015, I certainly noticed the landscape having changed dramatically. I think now we talk a lot more about mental health in athletics. It's acknowledged more. It's not seen as a sign of weakness. It's seen as a part of your training. Talk a little bit about maybe what age you typically start to see kids maybe expressing some mental health struggles that go along with their sports, and that comes with just being a competitor.
Yeah, it's a good question. It really ties into the whole idea of understanding sort of the developmental trajectory that we all go through, and understanding what role sports plays in that. And if you're around kids playing sport, and when I say kids, maybe like 10 and under, right? Like they just have this natural joy, natural confidence. One of my mentors, Bill Morgan, always used to say, why are we always struggling to get people to be active and fit? Why is it for adults that's such a hard thing? When you go to a playground and you look at 5-year-olds, you can't stop them from running around and being active and just always on the go. So what happens as we grow up? Um, and what happens partly in sport is social comparison, right? Like children take all their cues in the early years from parents, from coaches, and they just have this natural self-belief in whatever they're told, really. So one great thing is, if you've worked with young kids in coaching, that they believe they can do anything. Like they'll run a race and they'll finish dead last, but you'll say, let's do it again. And they'll be like, all right, this time I'll win. It's like they've got that ability not to really worry about looking at other people. But that obviously starts to creep in once adolescence hits. And one of the really important models of developmental sports psychology that we use right now suggests that there are sort of three big stages that we go through as athletes. The sampling years, where we're just like trying out lots of things and seeing what we like. The specializing years, where we're starting to narrow our focus and say, oh, this is what I like, I don't like that, I'm going to focus on this. And then the commitment or investment years, where we start to, if we really start to have sports be a part of our life on a permanent basis, we start to invest time heavily in becoming good at something. And the experts really suggest that we really shouldn't hit the investment stage until about 15 or 16 years of age, because up until that time, we really don't have all the cognitive, emotional coping skills to really deal with what it takes to invest the sort of time that it requires to become really good. So as you say, self-doubt, comparison with others, lack of enjoyment, all of those can creep in sort of like the middle adolescent years. And sometimes it happens when there's a misalignment of the way you're developing with those sort of stages, trying to invest too early, for example, right? Or the child's goals are not aligned with the parents' goals or the coach's goals. And so the enjoyment isn't there. So those are things we try to be more aware of, to be honest, nowadays in youth developmental programs.
And it's interesting because, I myself have experience and even memories of particular, friends of mine who, as you just said, the alignment wasn't there. And maybe the parents were, the driving force rather than the children at certain points, or, thinking when I got to college and talking with some of the other athletes and being like, well, when did you start lifting? Or when did you start doing doubles? And just seeing across the board, some are saying, I was 11, others saying, oh, I was 16, or some saying, this is my first time here in college. And also attributing that with who seems the happiest and who's still very much, in love with the sport. What
Right.
have you found that the athletes who are able to combat those feelings are doing? Like what do the best athletes do to be able to navigate those feelings, because you're already navigating a lot in adolescence and there's a lot of other changes happening too.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. Just from personal experience, when I came to Connecticut in the 1990s and started a private practice, having worked at the Olympic, committee and at that level for over a decade, I thought, oh, I'll work with a lot of really high level athletes. And a lot of the referrals I got were young people, 10, 11, 12, 13. And it was often these sort of instances where they seemed to not be enjoying it anymore. Or the parents would say, oh, they don't have the killer instinct and things like that. So it was interesting to work with athletes, and just as you said, often it was like they weren't enjoying it anymore, even though they were only 15, but they've been doing it, intensely for 5 or 6 years. So I think one of the things that I always found in working with my clients is it's not combating those feelings, because those are natural feelings. It's more like, it's one of the reasons like acceptance and commitment therapy has become a very big influence in sports psychology over the last decade or so, and also mindfulness training, because those really align with the whole process of sports, which is, if some of those things start to creep in, they're telling us something, right? If you're starting to get burned out if you're starting to get very anxious about what you're doing. It's not like you can't fight that. It's like recognizing, where is that coming from? Why is that happening? And then what should I do about it? And sometimes it's learning to accept some of that and understand the process by which it happens. Anxiety is certainly a part of high performance. When you really want something and you want it to go really well, you start to get anxious about it. But sometimes, feelings of lack of enjoyment, for example, are telling you, maybe I'm not aligning my values with my activities in the right way. And I need to step back and figure out, why do I want to do this? Who am I doing it for? What are my goals? What do I really want to get out of it? And what role should it play? What priority should it play in my life? And so I think those sort of negative feelings are really important to recognize and accept, but then act on in a purposeful way, so that you are making them part of your life rather than trying to sort of fight them off.
And so that's speaking directly to the athlete, which, maybe the 11-year-old athlete isn't going to find their way to the Recovery with Root podcast, but maybe the parent is. And a lot of times, you know, I can say from experience, like the parents will have a very big impact on the outcome of how successful that child is going to be. Because as you just said, if they're pushing when they should be maybe, pulling back a little bit or vice versa, that can really have a negative impact, and sometimes you could get burned out, and I've seen many athletes get burned out to the point that they don't come back. And depending on which sport it is, like I was swimming, that could be a particularly mentally grueling sport. You have like one or two instances a year where you're trying to shave off a hundredth of a second. It's very easy for kids to get disgusted with it and say, no, I'm done, I'm done. Speak to the parent on how and what to look out for, and maybe how to juggle their own emotions with wanting to offer the best opportunities for their kids, but also realizing that there are stages, as you just mentioned. You can't rush certain things, and there is something to be said for maybe allowing the child to have opportunities that, let's say they go to college and play a sport, there's more room to add into their routine. They haven't been doing that amount that they're doing in college since they've been in seventh grade, for instance.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And based on that experience I told you about, working with a lot of young athletes when I moved here to Connecticut, I wrote a book called The Cheers and the Tears, a healthy alternative to the dark side of youth sports. And I explored a lot of this. And one of the things that so many parents came up to me and were like, "Oh, that book really resonated with me." Like, it was a lot of coaches came up and said, "Oh, I use it all the time." When I'm working with families and with teens. One of the things I think that is really seductive about youth sports is it's very easy for the parent to over-identify with what the child is going through. So if you're standing, and I even experienced this. I had two kids, and neither of them were really serious into sports, but my son played all the typical things, swimming and little league, and you'd sit in the bleachers, when he was pitching, and you'd hear other adults around you going, come on, this kid sucks, you can hit him, and you're like, hey, that's my son. But so it's very natural, I think, for parents to sort of like get, sort of a little bit over involved with being protective, about their children. So one of the things that I talk about a lot with parents is letting that go, right? And really recognizing that this is for the child, right? It's got nothing to do with me. It's not a reflection on my ego or my success or anything as a parent. But what is best for the child? And again, going back to the developmental model, right? In the sampling is important, right? Allowing a child freedom to explore different things, even if they're sports, breaking, that we saw a lot of at the Olympics, got a lot of publicity, or skateboarding or BMX, whatever it is that, the child may want to get into, if it's possible, and if the parent can, financially support some of those opportunities, allowing the child to explore different things. And then, during the middle adolescent years, sort of really resisting that temptation to get like overly specialized too early. And that was one of the things, by the way, we used to see at the Olympic Committee, is that a lot of athletes that were like junior age champions, under 12 national champion, under 13 national champion, they didn't make it at the Olympic level. There's a lot of reasons for that, I think, but I think one of them is this whole idea of like early specialization can almost be a detriment to blossoming as an athlete as you get older and you have that capacity to really choose for yourself, like, oh, this is the sport I really love, this is what I'm going to specialize in, because then you have that capacity to deal with those moments, as you said, in a season that can be so frustrating and disheartening, where it's like, well, I'm doing everything the coach is telling me to, and those hundredths of a second are just not coming off, you know. But if you're a little bit older and a little bit more emotionally developed, you have some capacity to deal with some of that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons, I think, for parents to think about with particularly raising children that are good at sports.
And it's interesting too, because when we talk about this, I can't help but think about my own experiences. And in my family, my mother was a world class athlete and just narrowly missed the 1976 game, so she very much had experience at a high level, experience on a national team. And it's funny because one of her former teammates, who she reconnected with years down the line, and I swam with their children, we had very different approaches with the parents. So like I was doing many other sports. I probably started specializing in swimming in ninth grade, so around kind of that age mark you're talking about. But up until then, I was doing softball and dance, and and it was kind of like, well, that was the one I was best at, so okay, we'll just keep going with that, but waiting to hold back. And sometimes what we found was my mom was, I remember her friend saying to her, well, why, well, she should be doing more, and she should, shouldn't be doing those other sports, and she should be going to more practices a week. Or sometimes some of the coaches too, telling her, well, we need to have her in more. She's coming 4 days a week. We need her 5, we need her 6. And my mom saying, I'm telling you, if you do that, she's going to quit. She's going to
Mhm.
quit. And having that fine line, it's almost like sometimes when the parent has the experience, it can work to your benefit or to your detriment. Because I think some parents, you see, they try to, maybe if they didn't make the Olympics or they didn't get to do their sport in college, trying to get that through their children. And so it's a little bit, it's always interesting to see which direction the parent's going to go to. But sometimes having that experience in the family can really lend itself to the child evolving. But for the parent that has no experience with sports, they can also feel really like, this is so new to me. And they can easily get wrapped up in listening to a coach or listening to other parents. What would you say to that person who's new to this world and maybe has no experience with athletics? And so they are more susceptible to, not every coach is a good coach. And so, maybe listening to advice that they don't need to be listening to.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think overall, those were the parents, and those are the parents that sometimes struggle, with the whole youth sport environment. And as I say, I think a lot of national youth sports now are being much more proactive than they used to be in terms of looking out for a healthy developmental trajectory. I think there's more, safe sports. There's more advocacy on behalf of athletes, so we don't get some of the honestly outright like emotional abuse situations that I think a lot of athletes have experienced in the past, and will can tell stories about. But you know, I think you're lucky when you come from a family where you have an experienced parent who can say, well, I've been through that, and I'm going to say, back off. I know my daughter. Let her do it on her own pace, and otherwise, as you say, she won't like it anymore. She'll burn out. So I think one of the things for parents that don't know the whole system is just really staying open-minded about it, really remembering that it's their children, right? They're putting the child's experience first, whatever they can do to keep them enjoying it. I mean, there is a fine line, right? Like sometimes kids will say, "Oh, I just want to give up. Like this is too hard," and sometimes they just need encouragement. Like, "No, you can do this. Let's stick with it." And sometimes it's a matter of talking it out and saying, "Hey, try it for a season. Let's make it to the end of the season. And if you really don't like it, then you can walk away and do some of these other things." But I just talk about the seductiveness of it. Try and resist that siren call of, as you say, sometimes well-meaning but overzealous coaches that are like, you have to do this, you have to sign up for this, you have to do this travel team. If you don't do this travel team, you'll be behind the 8 ball forever. Which again, our research, right, our knowledge, our expertise suggests that's not the case. Very often, athletes that do a lot of this sampling and are later in their specialization do very, very well, and sometimes they're in fact the most successful athletes. I always tell stories of athletes like Greg Norman in golf, that only took up golf when he was already 17 years old, which would seem extraordinarily late by today's standards. When you look at someone like a Tiger Woods, who was on national television when he was 4 years old, so it can really pay to back off and allow the child the space to grow up, really.
And, and we're talking, obviously, we're talking ultimately like Olympic Games or national team. And the percentage of athletes who do get to that level is really, really small. And so also like setting the kids and the parents up for reasonable expectations that, just because now more than ever with the internet and all of that, we have access to these athletes and their results and what's happening. So it might seem more accessible now more than ever, but it really is such a fine percentage of the world's population, essentially, who will go on to that level. But it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy sports, you can't do sports to a high level, to your highest level, and still get so many benefits of it. What could the, average person learn from, maybe how those elite athletes operate, but put it into their own practice? Because you still, I have plenty of friends who did not make an Olympic team and have beautiful experiences and memories of their time as athletes. And, having the objective, maybe that's, the back of your mind, that's your top goal, but that you have other goals that you can set up for yourself or for your children, so that you are still being reasonable with your expectations. I'm not saying don't shoot for the stars, but also not making it so that if the child doesn't make the Olympics or doesn't get a scholarship, that they feel like their whole experience with athletics was worth nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think there's two issues here, right? So the first issue is exactly what you say, like feeling like if you don't make it, if you don't get a scholarship, that it was all for nothing. And a lot of parents think that way. I think it's a sort of an American thing. Here in Connecticut, I think it happens a lot, but it's funny, like after I wrote The Cheers and the Tears, I would often get invited to do lectures and talk about the book in Chicago, in LA, in Washington, and wherever I went. When I'd meet the organizing committee and the parents who'd invited me, they say, it's the worst here in Chicago, or it's the worst here in Atlanta. The parents are so intense, So I think everywhere in the United States, we all think like, oh, it's really terrible here. But realizing that sports is not an investment. A lot of parents I would speak to would say, well, we're investing all this time and we really hope it pays off for a scholarship, and like, as like sports, your career can end in 1 second, just a bad injury, and that's it. And suddenly you can't compete at that level in that sport anymore. So just never thinking of it in that way as an investment. It's an investment in your development for sure, and it can be really important part of your life. The other thing I think that helps with that is thinking of it as lifelong. What do we know? A lot of the problems that we face in America in terms of health, a lot of it is through inactivity, poor lifestyle, and sports and physical activity is a great way to combat that, to stay healthy throughout one's life. So finding activities that you can enjoy. I've been very lucky. I think tennis is one of the best sports. I'm still playing it at age 67, and I know many of the folks that I play with are in their 70s and even and 80s, and it's just a great lifelong way to stay fit and socialize and be happy. So I think that's one thing, is right, just like not thinking of sport as an investment so that you don't set yourself up for failure if some of these ultimate goals don't happen, but realizing that it's an investment in your lifelong development. The second part of the question is really interesting. Like, what can we learn from athletes and highly successful athletes and elite athletes, and maybe apply it to some of our own more everyday experiences? A couple of things I was always struck by. I think one that's really, really important is just the ability to accept criticism. I could often tell at junior development camps at the Olympics in Colorado Springs, I'd say, boy, this athlete and this athlete, they're really on top of it. They're going up to the coaches and say, what can I do to get better at this? How do I understand that? They're working with the exercise physiologist. What does this mean, this VO2 max thing? Like, how can I? and they're just inquiring, and they didn't have like big egos. They didn't have to be like, oh, I'm already the best, and I don't need to hear any of that. And those kids, unfortunately, they usually flamed out, and they weren't around at the next camp the following year. So I think one thing that's really important, and I think it's a great lesson for life, is just humility and just realizing, hey, we don't have the answers. Let's seek it from people who do, and accept feedback and look for ways to get better. What are they telling us about some of the things that we can do to improve? So a coach is really helpful for that. A teacher. I just took up golf when I retired last year. It's a very frustrating sport, but I got an instructor, and it's really actually great for me as a sports psychologist to go through the frustration of learning a very difficult and challenging skill and saying, hey, Shane, remember all those lessons that you've taught athletes all these years, apply them to yourself. So that, I think that's a really important one, is the ability to seek out help. Another one you hear a lot nowadays, and I'm really encouraged by, is elite athletes. I saw it this weekend at Wimbledon. I saw it after the Evian Golf Championship, the LPGA major this weekend. They come up and they're like, I want to thank my team. I want to thank my parents, my friends, my coaches, my nutritionist, my exercise. They've got this support network, and like we may not need, a strength coach and a nutritionist and all that, but we all need support, and we all need a team, I think, to get through hard times. And so, the social aspect, I think, of participation and enjoyment is a really important lesson that we can learn from good athletes. And maybe a third one that I think is so important is just being in the moment. I think one of the things that sets excellent athletes apart, that helps them to accept, some of the stuff we were talking about early on in this conversation, right? The self-doubt, the anxiety, is being able to like say, all right, that's going to be there, right? The little voice in my head, you can't stop it. It's going to happen. But what I need to do right now is just focus on this particular moment. What can I control right now? The next shot, the next lap, and just commit to that 100%. I'm just going to go for it. That's exactly what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. I'm going to accept that some of the self-doubt is there. But maybe I'll learn some things like deep breathing, muscle relaxation, that'll help me just stay grounded and be able to get through some of those feelings of anxiousness or self-doubt. So yeah, those are three things that I think all of us can use in everyday life, really. I think they're really important life lessons.
Oh, and I love that you say those things so that hopefully, a parent who may be questioning or maybe new to this hears that and knows that there's so much benefit to your child being involved in athletics in some capacity that they'll carry with them for the rest of their life and set them up for success. That even if they don't go to the Olympics, if they don't make a national team, that you are still setting themselves, they're setting themselves up for success later on with good habits, good practices, good experiences, teammates, memories, all of that you just, might not be able to get elsewhere. Because when you look at the pressures that some, and you mentioned the pressures and also how quickly things can change, one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you is, when we talk about injury and how fast things can change and the pressures that people put on them. We here at Root Center, we're a mental health and addiction nonprofit, and we have several, of our clients who suffer from substance use, and some of them have been linked back to athletic injuries, surgeries, things like that, where maybe you're just so in the moment of, well, the coach tells me to do this, so I do that, and not realizing, and how addictions can start and how problems can start when you're so focused on the sport and that end goal that you're doing anything to get back to play, get back to, top performance, whatever it may be, and how that can sometimes go down a road that really is, what we want to avoid. Can you speak a little bit about how it's not uncommon for sometimes athletes to fall prey to substance use and things like that, to just be able to get by or to also cope with maybe not being able to get to the level they want?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things I think that guides me in all my work is that I'm not working with an athlete, right? I'm working with a human being, and the athleticism is a part of who they are, and their athletic identity is very important to them, but it doesn't define them. And as you say, I think all of us as human beings can be vulnerable to things like addiction, at vulnerable points in our life. And so what I'm trying to do when I work with an individual is find out like what are the vulnerabilities that have maybe led you to this point, and what can you do about them so that maybe you can overcome them, not certainly have it happen again or as much again in the future. Some of the times, you and I have both worked in the addiction field, for many years, and it can be a lifelong challenge, right? Just become something that, like, you realize this is a vulnerability I have, and it's something that I need to look out for and work on proactively just about every day of my life. So some of those things like perfectionism, I think, is a big one for athletes. That is what we make a distinction between sort of obsessive perfectionism and then the desire to do one's best. And those are very different things. And obsessive perfectionism is almost this like driven thing. Like I have to do it. I've got this timeline. I've got this internal clock that's driving me. And then if that is a major motivation, an injury can be just seen as like, oh, this can't happen. Like I've just got to get through this. How can I get through it? And so external aids can be a way, painkillers, performance enhancing substances, and so on. And that does leave one vulnerable to overuse. So really working on that and trying to recognize, where did that perfectionism come from? Uh, is that a healthy thing? No, it's not. What can I do about that? What are some alternatives I can explore? What are some other ways that I can contextualize this? What are some ways I can be kind to myself and take care of myself? It's such an important part of really recovery in addiction, but it's also an important part of recovery from athletic injury. Is self-care. So I think those are really important things for an individual to think about and to work on. And that's sort of the approach that I take with folks. And as you say, it happens in sport. In sport, it's not only addiction to the things that you and I are more familiar with, but performance enhancing substances are out there. And that can happen in several ways. There's a feeling I think that some athletes have, like everyone else is doing it, so why can't I? And maybe I should, and that's sort of a dangerous mind trap to fall into. And then another side of it that, and I think some of your listeners may relate to this, is sort of the whole sort of intoxication that some performance enhancing and appearance, we call them APEDs, appearance and performance enhancing drugs, um, can give you, which is like that look, that being ripped, that lean, and sort of falling in love with that and putting that at the top rather than, what am I doing that for in the first place? To get good at something or to enjoy something, to do it better, and so on. So there are a couple of interesting drivers, perhaps, of whether you want to call it addiction or overuse or dependence on substances that can really be unhealthy in the athletic sphere that you don't see perhaps so much in other areas of life.
And I always, I caution people too that, like we've been saying, not every parent is knowing what's going on. Not every coach is necessarily a good coach. That, sometimes it's the culture of sport too that really brings that out. I mean, I think it's changing a little bit more now, but that, idea of you're not sick, you're not hurt, you push through, take this so you can do practice, take this just so you can get to the next game. Sometimes it might not even be coming from the athlete. And if the athlete is so used to trusting the parent, trusting the coach, and following them blindly, um, that sometimes it's the people that we're looking to be the trusting figures, the ones to keep us safe, that are almost enabling that or kind of opening the door to those experiences that the athlete may never even have experienced. I mean, football comes to mind. How many folks are out there running with concussions and going back to play way earlier, and then now we have all this research on CTE and things that are developing later in life. I think it's changing a little bit now, but maybe, what do you see on your end? Do you see that maybe from the coaching side, there is more of an appreciation of the human body is just that, it is human? Because I think when I compare experiences to when I was training to when my mother has stories, It's lessened over the years, but I think back to things, 10 years ago that I went through that I hope other athletes are not going through now, via coaching or pressures and stuff like that. But sometimes it's not even the athlete that's putting the pressure on them. It can be coming from the parent or the coach.
No, that's a great point, Margot. It's a great point. That, it's sort of no pain, no gain philosophy. It's lessened, um, but it's still there to some extent. I've seen horror stories over the years with coaches that have really driven athletes, past the breaking point and have not given them the support that they really need. So I think one of the big things is for coaching is coaching education. Even at junior levels, having coaches be exposed to some of the knowledge that we have. You bring up concussions. I'm fortunate enough to have trained with some of the top concussion specialists in the U.S. And hear from them, attend lectures about these are the stages that happen. These are the protocols. And as you say, the being very, very erring on the side of caution nowadays, because they realize that the vulnerability period after one concussion is a lot longer than I think people ever thought, before. And part of it is I'm married to a neuropsychologist, so I hear about TBIs and I'm aware of them all the time. But that's an area like just giving youth sport coaches knowledge of something as simple as that, because they happen all the time. There's not many sports that don't involve some sort of contact. I mean, even seen it in tennis. People have tripped and fallen over and hit their heads. So like there's not many physical activities where a knowledge of concussion and the protocols to really handle it well isn't important. And along with that, I think, one of the things that when I'm called in to do coaching education is just a knowledge of child development, a knowledge of some of the stages that children go through, and knowing what's appropriate information to give to a 10-year-old versus a 15-year-old versus a 20-year-old, and you're working at very different levels at those three, age stages. So yeah, I'm encouraged. I really do think it is changing, Margot. I think a lot of the sports that we work with nowadays are really maybe sometimes due to outside pressure, and maybe sometimes due to the advocacy of athletes themselves who really speak up more nowadays. And goodness, the example that someone like Simone Biles sets, when she steps back and says, look, I'm not going to do this. It's dangerous. I know I'm in a space right now where this would be dangerous. That's it's a courageous act. And it really sets a wonderful example for others to say, wow, she can do that. I need to take care of myself too.
Well, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that was, a perfect example. She was such an advocate for mental health and physical health and listening to your body and trusting yourself. Because, I used to always say when I was swimming, I would say swimming is a part of my life. It is not my life. And there will be life after sport. And I think that's what I think is most important to remember, is that, when we're, hopefully a parent is listening to this and thinking, well, maybe I will get my children involved in sports. Seems like they could, just knowing that if they don't get to where you think they should be or where maybe they want it to be, life goes on after sport. Like there's a day when, even the best of the best are going to retire, and there's a lot of life to live after that. You got to figure out what to do with your time. And, as you said, if you've built up this disgust or resentment against movement, against the exercise, the pressures of it, it can really impact you for a long time. That, this can have a lot of mental impacts as well as physical. If you don't listen to yourself early on, that could be so detrimental when that child is then in their 30s, in their 40s, that they still have these lasting impact. And it is what it is, traumas even from their experience, whether it be physical or mental traumas that they experience from sport that take a long time to unpack. I can say personally, there's still things I'm unpacking in my own therapy from my own training, that I've experienced on my own. So it's reminding people that there's life after sport, there's life after that high level or low level, wherever you are, it's going to keep going on. It's not what you hang your hat on forever.
That's right. I think that's really important. And also, though, that experience can be such a valuable part of life. It can teach you all sorts of lessons. One of the things that we did at the Olympic Committee when I worked there, that still goes on today, that I'm very proud of, is that we started a career transition program for athletes, so that they could make that transition from, as you said, total commitment to this really high level, and then suddenly, it's all over. The Olympics is finished. That's not going to continue. What do I do with the rest of my life? Well, you've learned a lot of things about teamwork, about leadership, about commitment, setting goals, how to use imagery and so on, that can transfer over to many other areas of life. And I think that sport can teach really wonderful lessons if you take the time to learn those lessons and then apply them in other areas of life. So I think it's as you say, it's really important to realize that there's going to be an endpoint to that high level of commitment, but that this experience of high level of commitment can teach you a lot of things that can stay with you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, no, I can't think of the title of the book now, but I was reading something and a CEO was saying how he looked to hire veterans and past athletes because he knew that the commitment that they brought to the table was going to be something that would separate them from others. And as you just said, the time management, goal setting, working on a team, dedication, no matter what level you get to, those are, everybody on, when I think back to my team, not everybody went to the Olympics, but everybody had that same mission. We were there at the same times. We were working towards the same goals. And, most of those people went on to do pretty remarkable things in the years to come and finding careers and setting themselves up. But I also think, and I'm interested to see, with when you said the committee that you're setting up, there's, long been, fingers pointed at the NCAA, student athletes, like, oh, it's actually more like athlete students and putting the sport ahead of school. And I think that dynamic is changing a little bit too. Like, I think, the pressures of when you go to college as a student athlete or even in high school, that's kind of starting to have that mentality shift of being like, okay, well, I don't think they're going to be as successful in their sport if they also can't manage other aspects of their life, like, being able to go to class and doing those things and knowing that you can't put all your eggs in one basket. That can be a challenge too for a lot of people.
Yeah, when we introduced the concept of like, hey, let's take some time with these current athletes to talk about what they're going to do after the Olympics, we got a lot of pushback. They're like, they we don't want to distract them. You're wasting your time. And in fact, what we were able to convince them from the athletes themselves who provided the feedback was like, look, people are already thinking about it, right? They're not stupid. They realize that their lives can't, and many of them have had things like injuries and so on. So they know that, things can change in a heartbeat. Um, isn't it much better to be able to think through these things and think about like what are some of the things to do and how to prepare for it and to put your mind at ease so you can then get back to focusing on the things that you're doing that you're trying to be really successful at. So yeah, I think mainly due to outside pressures, it's changing perhaps
Unfortunately, but yes, good that it happened.
at the college level to put the person first rather than just the athlete. Although, goodness, there's always so many challenges, like social media and name, image, and likeness, and so on. So there's always challenges for every
Definitely a
generation.
different ballpark now than it was now,
Absolutely.
especially with the NIL. That could be a whole other episode. But
Right.
kind of like the idea to wrap on this idea of knowing that there's more after, and whether that's after the Olympics, after high school, after little league, whatever there is, that there's the next chapter, and preparing for that, because I think you hit the nail on the head. It is going to happen, and if we're talking about the highest level, like the post-Olympic blues, post-Olympic depression, that's something I experienced. It's something most of my teammates experience. It's very real, and when you don't have the ideas of what am I going to do next, and I have nothing else in my life, and you make the athlete believe that there's nothing else that's important besides that, that's where you really start to see the negative detriment. And that can be applied even to younger ages. So if we're speaking to the parent who's, their kids in a summer league and they love it and it's their favorite thing, okay, well, getting them ready for, okay, well, what's our plan for when we go back to school or when this season ends and when you're not on this team anymore? Because when you're, growing up, you got a different baseball team every year, and it's not the same necessarily as maybe when you're in a college team and you're on that team for 4 years and you're staying there. That can really extend back into childhood, of letting the parents be able to set the child up for what comes next, because there's always going to be afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. And I think for the individual, the young person, for them to realize it's a common condition, that self-doubt and wondering what does come next. I think we have a tendency to put like Olympic athletes and professional athletes on a pedestal, and say, oh, they're these super people. I tell you, having run those workshops on career transitions for athletes for over a decade, I spoke to so many. I mean, these are people that won gold medals, and they're saying, "Oh, now what do I do with myself? I don't have the confidence to do X, Y, or Z." And it's like they're just human beings, right? We all go through it. We have that self-doubt, like, what is the next step? How am I going to deal with this? How am I going to get through it? They go through that as much as we do. So I think, as you say, acknowledging it and preparing for it is a good thing to do.
Well, and if nothing else, I mean, I think we're also in a great position here in the United States. I mean, we're one of very few countries in the world where you can go to school and also be an athlete, particularly in college. Like we have the NCAA that's set up for that. I have a lot of former teammates having competed for France. Nothing against, them and their decision, but a lot of them put off school until they retired, after they got their high school diploma and really felt lost. And almost some of them I can point to maybe held on to the sport for longer than they should have or longer than they wanted to because they didn't know what was next. They didn't have a career choice. They didn't have experience in other things. And then, if everything went well in their sport, then hopefully that would carry them into that next chapter. But for those where it didn't, the way I saw some ex-teammates of mine be so lost and, into their 30s, trying to figure out what do I do because some of them were, training into their 30s and going to these meets and not making the cuts anymore, but they didn't know what else to do. And I think in that sense, we're a little bit more fortunate here that we do have programs set up that if that is the route that you take, that you can do both, but also knowing when to push back. I can think of a teammate of mine specifically who took longer to graduate than she would have liked because she maybe followed some guidance of swimming first, forget about your schoolwork. And then, she just now has graduated med school and is now a physician, but it took her significantly longer to get back to take classes over again that she had maybe not, done so well when she was younger. And it was so tough to watch that I hope now that dynamic is changing because we have these opportunities. We have the systems in place to allow people to do both. So I hope people take advantage of that.
And she became a physician. Oh, good for her,
She did,
And
and I will tell
she'll
you,
probably be all the stronger for that experience.
yeah, and I will tell you it was something I had battled with. I couldn't take classes, for instance, between 1 and 5 p.m. for broadcasting because I was in the pool and being told, no, you just can't take it. So I didn't take a broadcast class till my senior year of high school. I graduated, or my senior year of college. I graduated. I had done one broadcast package. I had no experience, no nothing. And I ended up going to get a master's, not because you needed one to do broadcast journalism, but because I was like, I never had an internship. I never had these classes. I needed more experience. And so I went and did that. But I've seen, different scenarios play out with past teammates of mine where some were, hard headed and they said, no, I know there's life after sport, but some got swept up in that. And if their parents didn't know any different to step in, then they graduated and it was on to the next class and you had to figure it out on your own. So, I caution parents to just know that like we have a good setup here where the kids can do both. Let them do both. Let them be a student as much as they are an athlete as well.
Yeah, absolutely. College is for a reason, right?
Because then you got to do something when it's done, hopefully. Well, Shane, thank you so much. Is there anything you think that I've missed or that you would like to add to any of our listeners out there or any takeaways?
Oh, you and I could talk about this forever, Margot. I know. But I think we hit on some great points, today. The whole idea of accepting feedback, working with support. If you feel like it is too much for you, reach out to others. There are always folks out there willing to help. And we sometimes forget that when we're in the midst of our own darkest hours or our own deepest feelings of frustration and despair. So I really enjoyed talking about this with you.
Oh, I really appreciate your insight as always. It'll be interesting to see, what else you uncover in your continued research. I hope that every time I check in with you, that you're telling me it's improving, because I think the athletes of the world deserve better. They deserve more. Sports can really afford
We're
you.
always learning. I tell you that.
Always learning. Well, Shane, thank you so much. I appreciate your insight and for joining us here today.
Thank you very much, Margot.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast, Recovery with Root. As always, stay connected with us on social media to learn about when next podcast episodes will drop. You can comment, ask questions, even let us know about future topics that you'd like to see discussed. Until next time, remember, progress is the destination.